Thanks very much. How do we restore and enhance our environment? It's another panel with an economist on it. That's me. Okay, what was America's best idea? Commonly purported and regarded as being the establishment, actually, of the world's first national park in 1872, Yellowstone. Go to Yellowstone, see how science interacts with conservation, public participation, education and advocacy. Of all the national parks I think I've been in around the world, that would still be the one I would hold as number one in this regard. New Zealand's first national park was established just 22 years later, just 22 years after Yellowstone. Tongariro, Ngāti Tū Wharatoro were pretty concerned actually about the expansion of European settlers, so they had their mountain set aside as a reserve by the Native Land Court, and the Tongariro National Park Act came in 1894. For me, that comparison suggests that New Zealand has an inheritance on conservation that's really second to nobody's. But that's the past. We're here really to talk about the here and now and the future. So the question for the panel today really is, how do we shape up on these issues in the contemporary context, and where does conservation fit with the future that we intend to carve out for ourselves and our children and so on? I would suggest that over recent decades, environmental protection and conservation has oscillated actually in the public's mind from being of marginal interest, headlining when there's a sit-in the trees, or being an issue of national pride actually when people talk about how clean and green New Zealand is. We dine out on that line so much, it's sickening. With such variable public interest, is it any wonder then that we have a fragmented ad hoc approach to the subject of environment and its protection and enhancement? Yes, we have a Department of Conservation, a Ministry of the Environment and an Environmental Protection Agency. So nobody can accuse the government of not having the machinery in place to facilitate a coherence. But when it comes to public concern, whether from households or firms, conservation and the environment are sort of nice to haves, more than they are essentials integrated in our daily decision making. Those daily decisions, of course, surround issues around our jobs and our families, and those are our dominant preoccupations. Only occasionally is the environment a visitor to that space. Maybe recycling bins would be our greatest achievement over the last few decades in terms of integrating the environment into the mainstream. However, change is afoot, both negative and positive. As global population growth and economic development carry on interminably, the cost of human expansion is becoming clearer and clearer to more and more people as they suddenly come face to face with the consequences. 10 days ago, I was in Beijing. Beijing's quite now a modern city, you'd almost say. Parts of it are amazing, like Manhattan. And the people right around, some of them who aren't in the Mercs and the Maseratis, they ride around on their bicycles, but they all have masks on to save their lungs from the consequences of what they're doing to their environment. When we were there, China's Environment Minister said, in China's thousands of years of civilization, the conflict between humanity and nature has never been as serious as it is today. 2 months ago, just by way of contrast, we were on Macquarie Island down in the Southern Ocean, which is one of the most isolated places in the world, which is occupied mainly by meteorologists, and you know, there's only so much time setting a balloon up one a day takes. So they have a bit of time on their hands, and one of the tasks that they do is they crawl along this beach once a month, mark out a 100 metre patch, and they crawl along this beach shoulder to shoulder, and they pick up garbage. And they record that garbage, its origin, they catalogue it all. They've been doing this actually since 1991. And when you look at the time series data on that work, the amount of plastic on that beach just goes like that. Absolutely exponential. A lot of it's plastic fragments these days. It used to be dominated by fishing gear. That's changing over the years, and some of the plastic they can source all the way back to Asia, the Asian continent itself. So, you know, we are all joined. It's not just the atmosphere that goes around, the oceans do as well. But those little examples really are tiny compared to the big daddy of them all, which most people in this room will appreciate, is the environmental impact from anthropogenic climate change, whose impact is very far-reaching, both in terms of human habitation, but also its impact on all ecosystems. One of the things that became very obvious from a trip down south for 30 days in the ship that we hired, we had the ship and we put 10 scientists on it, and then put 40 ordinary New Zealanders on it. So we had sort of teachers and plumbers and policemen and all the rest of it, and 10 scientists who couldn't go anywhere. They were locked up with these people for 30 days. That's how you make scientists communicate, by the way. There was nowhere for them to hide. They actually got quite coherent after about 4 days. And they absolutely loved it. But one of the many things they taught us and demonstrated to us is how one of the impacts of climate in that Southern Ocean is the warmer currents have moved south, and with them the invasion of the warmer current species. And the cold current species are retreating to the south. Think things like Adelie penguins that used to be on the Antarctic Peninsula now are forced further south. And there's only so far south you can go, of course. So big changes in food supplies in the ocean as a result of what we're doing, miles and miles away. So nobody escapes that. So we better have a bit of good news before we start slashing your wrists. As people's wealth rises, they become more concerned about their environment and emboldened to do something about it and enabled to do something about it as well. That's the good news. We witnessed this. It was actually referred to, I think, referred to it in the last session, in terms of consumer accreditation of products, like marine sustainability, blue ticks and that sort of thing. So that's the good news. And policy is reacting to that. We are slowly moving from a world of GDP, by the way. Even the New Zealand Treasury has been looking at happiness indexes. Good God, unbelievable. But there's a limit to which you can push any of these indexes. On the happiness index, if you measure it by the width of your smile, the Americans would win that, wouldn't they? But of course, the Russians think that the Americans suffer from idiocy. So you've got to be careful what index you use. And there's quite a bit of work actually being done on well-being. We're doing quite a bit on it, which uses a whole lot of indicators. GDP or income is definitely one. happiness is another. But things like sustainability, how people value the environment and so on. So that debate is yet to be had. We've got to build the indexes first and then they can be put up for discussion. But the most important thing is until people vote according to those wider measures, you can forget dreaming about it. If what they vote on is their standard living, material standard living, that's what you're dealing with. There's no escape. So it's not an overnight process. We have to mainstream conservation and environmental protection. And to do that, in my view, you have to internalise the costs of pollution. You don't have local bodies and governments running around cleaning up the mess and trying to recover the cost in taxes. You actually internalise it to the cost that the person who chooses to pollute as part of their process faces. That's our challenge. And then, if you did that, those decisions would be internalised. You know, they would be part of the mainstream decisions that we make every day. Shall I produce this plastic bottle? Oh God, it's going to cost me another $1 or whatever it is, because of unless I can prove that, you know, it's not contaminating the environment. Until we do that, we're going to have an ad hoc approach. We're going to have oil spills, you know, simultaneous with ideological outbursts of activism to bring attention to it. We need to, I think, grow up and make conservation and environmental enhancement part of our mainstream. The more we mess our nest, the closer we're getting to that point. I think the issue is how much damage will we have done to our nest before the trend, the current trend of degradation to the environment, is actually held and halted. I don't know the answer to that, but that's the question that we face. So today we're going to get a number of perspectives on this from the panel. We'll open with Dr. Rick Boven, who really, his thesis is that how you think about this and how the solutions you come up for with this stuff really depends on the paradigm that you use. Namely, can economic growth continue in an unfettered manner? Technology always wins out, or are there limits to growth and constraints around that? Depending on which of those you subscribe to, as an example, you'll come up with a different answer. So, Rick.
Good afternoon. There are many useful ideas about what we should do to protect and restore our natural environment, and we're often told that we've got technologies and policies to solve environmental problems if only we would act. So if you think about environmental management, it's got 3 layers. There's a technical layer. How do we trap possums, for example? There's a policy layer. How do we fund the traps and how do we set the rules around the use of those traps? And then there's an implementation layer. How do we get the policies adopted and the resources committed? My contribution today is going to be to focus on a way to increase the motivation, the effort and the resources committed to protect and restore our environment. But I've got a deeper purpose too. I want to ask whether we're using the right paradigm to develop our future. We're all guided by paradigms that help us to understand the world that we live in. Paradigms are models of the world, usually developed by learned leaders, scientists and others. Paradigms are transmitted to the general population through socialisation, education and social interaction. When scientists study the world, the paradigms they use influence the questions they ask and the way they go about their work. Theories exist within paradigms. Paradigms are powerful and they're pervasive. They guide our thinking without us having much awareness of them. We take it for granted that the Earth and planets orbit the Sun, but others have held different beliefs. Paradigms, like scientific theories, change when they become obsolete. Relativity emerged as a new paradigm only after research demonstrated that Newtonian physics did not provide an adequate description of physical processes. There's a very big paradigm that dominates our worldview today. We believe that we are living within a continuous trend of progress, from fire and stone through bronze, iron, steel, computers, genetics and nanotech, to the future portrayed in science fiction. In this dominant paradigm, technological innovation and stocks of capital and labour increase indefinitely, fueling continuous economic growth. In the dominant paradigm, environmental issues are temporary inconveniences overcome by development and deployment of new technologies and policies. And I will repeat what has been said before. The goals of societal management today are to grow GDP. And GDP measures the revenues that are available for business, and to grow GDP per capita, which measures the consumption available for individuals. There is no limit to growth, and growth continues indefinitely. Many people are questioning whether indefinite economic growth is possible in a finite world, especially now that environmental constraints are becoming important. I prefer an alternative paradigm, which does not assume mankind's history to be the unfolding of a continuous process of progress and growth. Prior to the era of traditional agriculture, when humans were hunter-gatherers, population densities were low, very low, and relatively stable because trees and grass are not very productive. The technology of traditional agriculture dramatically increased population densities, but population grew only slowly from 10,000 years ago to 1800 AD. In Europe, under normal circumstances, during the agriculture era, environmental constraints meant that populations would grow rapidly for around a generation, and then some combination of famine, war, and disease would reduce them. But population and economic growth accelerated rapidly after 1800, driven by fossil fuels, rapid technological advance, the so-called discovery of the world, and subsequent growth of trade. The environmental constraints that had controlled population during the traditional agricultural era became functionally irrelevant. Global output has grown by a factor of around 60 times since 1800, and it's projected to roughly triple again by 2050. But the environmental constraints are becoming relevant again. In the dominant economic paradigm, progress goes on forever. In the alternative paradigm, the growth phase is temporary, lasting only until the economy expands sufficiently that the environmental constraints re-emerge. Just as Newtonian physics is a special case within a more general relativistic paradigm, the rapid economic growth phase of the last 200 years can be viewed as a special case within a more general economy environment paradigm. The rapid growth phase occurs when technological innovation is so rapid that environmental constraints temporarily become functionally irrelevant. Modern economic theory was developed within the growth phase, so it's designed to explain and to manage growth. Economic theory has little or nothing to say about how the growth phase will end. In conventional modern economics, we assume free gifts of resources can be taken from the environment without limit, and free disposals of wastes can be made to the environment without limit. Those two paradigms I have described are in conflict today, with the alternative ecological paradigm slowly gaining share relative to the dominant economic one. But that paradigm conflict is not really well recognised. I don't have time here to go through the evidence that leads me to conclude that the ecological paradigm offers a better way to think about how to manage our future. I've looked at the evidence from economic history and economic theory, the history of civilizations, the dynamics of biological populations, and the work of social scientists, philosophers of history, and ecological economists. Most important, I've looked at the numbers. In the ecological paradigm, the growth phase ends when the economy grows to or expands past the level that is sustainable given the size of the physical environment and the technologies that are used to exploit that environment. Ecological footprint analysis reveals that the global economy is already much larger than what is sustainable, and the economy is projected to grow by another 3 times by 2050. Despite those observations, accelerating growth remains the societal objective for followers of the dominant paradigm. In the alternative paradigm, the societal goal is to reduce the economy's overshoot of the environment that supports it, to manage risks, and to reach a soft landing where the future economy can be sustained by the future environment. Widespread adoption of the alternative ecological paradigm would change the way we understand and manage our world. In the new paradigm, growth becomes one contributor to the goal of securing a soft landing which matches environmental capacity and economic activity. A wealthy and technologically sophisticated society has a much better prospect of responding to uncertain future challenges successfully. But the quality of output matters too. Our performance metric GDP counts the costs of waste, pollution, crime and sickness as positives, and it takes no account of the depletion of environmental resources which results from economic activity. The alternative paradigm implies different goals and metrics, and I'd be happy to talk about some different economic metrics we could use later. A new paradigm means different scientific questions too. attention shifts to understanding an uncertain future. There is reduced focus on deep specialisation to establish professional credentials and push the boundaries of understanding, and more emphasis on connections and interactions, on complexity, and on contributions to effective societal management. The new questions will require even more collaboration among scientists with different foundation disciplines. And as public understanding changes, environmental processes will be more widely recognised as central to securing our future, leading to greater motivation, effort, and resource commitment to protect and restore our natural environment. Adoption of the ecological paradigm would lead us to choose different societal goals and performance metrics. Priorities for science and policy would change, and we would have a better chance to reduce overshoot and achieve a soft landing. We owe it to our children. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rick, for that. From the bottom up experience. Don Huse, most of you will know Don, a lot of you will know Don as one of New Zealand's leading business people, but he also, for his sins, is a trustee of Zealandia. So now we'll get some real practical experience. Thanks, Don.
Thanks, Chairman. So it's publicly confirmed. I'm a sinner. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, ngā tātou koutou. Greetings. It's great to be here. When confronted with environmental stresses and strains of immense global dimension, it's understandably difficult for individuals, for families, for communities to know how they can respond, how they can make a difference. One way we can do it is by being involved, by being committed, by being activist at a grassroots, at a bush floor level. So I'm going to speak to you about Zealandia and the Karori Sanctuary Trust as a bit of a case study in terms of how individuals, families and communities can make a lasting difference. Why am I qualified to do this? Well, for my sins. I became involved in the early 90s during the establishment phase of Karori Sanctuary, and then subsequently I've been recycled and am back as a trustee now some 10 or 15 years later. In referring to the Karori Sanctuary Trust, I acknowledge Professor Sir Paul Callaghan. I met and worked with Paul over 2.5 years. He was a compellingly eloquent advocate of our cause. Can I also acknowledge certain other people who have been deeply involved with the Trust who are here? And I'm thinking in particular of Charles Doherty. I'm thinking of Peter Orport. Thanks, Peter, for getting me into the spot. And also, of course, Fran Wild, who, as Mayor of Wellington, was very involved and very supportive of the establishment of the Trust right back in the 1990s. Let me set a fairly grand scene, and just forgive me when I quote this, but it's from our souvenir guide. And some of this factual material was corroborated by comments made earlier. But 80 million years ago, the landmass that was to become New Zealand broke away from Gondwana, setting our islands off on a unique evolutionary path that is still shaping our flora and fauna to this day. Its name was Zealandia. Zealandia was reclaimed from the sea. Our islands became an ark for animals and plants found nowhere else on Earth. Lost lineages and living fossils. The land of giants where birds were the top of the food chain. 80 million years, less than 1,000 years ago, everything changed. Animals were hunted to extinction, forests were burned and felled, wetlands were drained, grasslands were grazed and ploughed, successive waves of settlers brought with them a range of new animals and plants that quickly became pests. The survivors of Zealandia started to vanish. So Zealandia is managed by the Karori Sanctuary Trust. It comprises an 8.6 kilometre predator-proof fence. It encloses 225 hectares and a most engaging education centre. The fence contains regenerating bush. We see this as a 500-year project. Not too many of us are expecting to see the end of this project, but we live and aspire to that being achieved over that period of time. Now this fence keeps out 14 or so critters. This includes rats, mice, possums, stoats, ferrets. They've been mentioned here over the last day and a half several times. Now that fence was completed in 1999. Now we're a community-based, independent, not-for-profit charitable trust. And for those of you who don't know where it's positioned, we're just a few kilometres from Parliament, from the Wellington CBD. There's the kaka and the tui fly. Financials are interesting and are part of the burden of life and reality when you're in this game, I've got to say, but just bear with me. We're financed annually from revenue, from subscriptions. We've got about 11,500 members. We get a lot of revenue from admission tickets, from cafe and store sales. Our in-kind pro bono contribution from about 450 volunteers is valued at something like $1 million a year. We get another $1 million in sponsorships and grants from a vast variety of people and institutions. This is community groups, service clubs, businesses large and small, local, national, international. The Wellington City Council, of course, is a strategic partner of ours and has been from the beginning. We also got a lot of startup funding as well from people like the Community Trust of Wellington, the New Zealand Government Significant Community-Based Projects Fund. We're supported by iwi, big time, by the Department of Conservation, by Forest and Bird, Victoria University. We've got this vast inventory of supporters out there which has now been mobilised to this particular cause. Of course, we've got management and staff who are equally involved. So I guess the big thing is that in the space of less than 20 years, we are now, I believe, a world-class conservation organisation. Now, how do we measure that? Well, by the year 2000, we had a sanctuary that was free from mammal pests. Weka, brown teal, little spotted kiwi were released. About 40 little spotted kiwis. We're now north of 100, maybe 120. In 2001, we've got whiteheads, bellbirds, robins, tomtips. Our first kiwi chick was hatched. Subsequent years, we've had kaka, saddlebacks, hihi, tuatara, Maud Island frogs, Cook Strait giant weta. They've all been successfully released in this particular space. Our 100th kaka chick has been banded. Our first baby tuatara was born. Here's a stat. More than 265,000 native trees, shrubs and herbs have been planted in this space. So we are a successful enterprise, we believe. We've got 5 strategic objectives: conservation and research, education, recreation and tourism, community involvement and corporate management. So if you were to go through our agenda, and Charles, you'll smile at this, but when you think of the conversation we've had here in the last day and a half, science talking to the rest of the community, or the rest of the community talking to science, that's what our board meetings do, because we have an agenda paper that goes through conservation and research, education, recreation and tourism, the whole thing. So we're actually a microcosm, I think, of what we're talking about trying to achieve here today. Now these objectives have all been achieved. We're a bit short on the funding self-sustainability thing at the moment, but that's a work in progress. My chairman might speak more about that. We'll see. But let's just now project ourselves forward. One little sanctuary. But good ideas, great ideas are catchy. And so now it's contagious. We've got in New Zealand a number of other reserves. Tawharanui in Auckland, Mangataltari in Waikato, Andy Lowe and Julian Robertson's Cape Sanctuary in the Hawke's Bay. We've got Morokanui in Otago. We've got the Dancing Star Preserve down at Stewart Island. So the amazing growth in these individual sanctuaries brings me to this big vision that Paul Callaghan advocated so strongly. The big vision was suggested by him as a mad idea to be styled New Zealand's Apollo project, to be called, said Paul, the Zealandia program. When referring to this in her April 2012 New Zealand Listener article, Rebecca Priestley quoted Paul as saying, "Let's get rid of the lot. Let's get rid of all the damned mustelids, all the rats, all the opossums from the mainland islands of New Zealand. And we start with Rakiura, with Stewart Island, and we work our way up. Thinking big, that's great. Forget the reputation of thinking big, but this was Paul, it seems to me, at his most eloquent and his most compelling. If such a vision could be realised, our mainland sanctuaries could form the nucleus of a cohort of fence sanctuaries to protect and disperse native species and advance pest eradication. So, my case is, locally based initiatives can make a difference. and when boldly multiplied, can make a lasting and material difference. It must happen. Our native bush is becoming silent. Silent. As silent as a graveyard. Our bush is meant to be noisy. It's meant to resonate. And when you go to these areas where there has been this restoration, the volume is turned up. I can't bear of my children, my grandchildren, to go into a bush that is silent. That bush is dead. Our native bird species and their populations are in decline. The luxuriance and diversity of our native flora are in retreat. These symptoms of a serious and possibly terminal malaise are not in dispute. That humankind is responsible is not in dispute. We'll be held indictable by generations to come if we don't reverse these trends. Mainland fenced sanctuaries promoted by and complemented by community and citizen-led initiatives, sustained through membership, visitation, volunteers, grants, donors, sponsors from public and private sources, offer real hope. Our best hope, our only hope. So, can we restore and enhance our environment? Yes, we can. Must we restore and enhance our environment? Yes, we must. Kia ora. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Don. Well done. Okay, now thriving ecosystems obviously are incredibly important, whether they're human or animal, and the interaction between both equally critical in terms of disease containment and so on. To talk on that subject, Nigel French, Professor of Food Safety and Veterinary Public Health at Massey.
Thank you very much. So I've got three messages which I'm going to expand on over the next 7 minutes. The first one is that healthy, thriving, sustainable ecosystems are important for the health of humans, domestic animals and wildlife, and that these are inextricably linked. Secondly, that New Zealand has particular and unique challenges related to ecosystem health that impact on population health, public health and the economy. And third, that recent scientific advances and a collaborative, interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral approach under what we call a One Health paradigm offer ways to improve the health of New Zealand populations, and we've made some major advances, I think, in recent years. So first of all, ecosystems provide a number of goods and services, and these have a direct impact on the health and well-being of populations. And these are things such as food, drinking water, fuel, and also other services such as water purification, recreation, and obviously things like clean air, and even the production of medicines as well. And these resources are obviously not free, and they're not limitless, and there are obvious trade-offs between these which are involved in environmental decision-making, particularly in managed ecosystems. Improving one can have a deleterious effect on another, and a good example of that is food production, which reduces biodiversity, can have an impact on water quality and water availability. This is a tension between resource exploitation and resource conservation, which was mentioned by Sir Peter earlier on. So ecosystem, there are a number of major issues which both affect and are affected by ecosystem health, such as farming practices, climate change, biosecurity, which was mentioned earlier as well. And many of these are related to the transmission and cycling of pests and pathogens, which is the area that I'm particularly interested in. And over the last few decades, these ecosystems have changed more rapidly than any other time in human history, and mainly to meet the demands for food, water, timber, fuel, and those sorts of things. And this has resulted in a degradation of ecosystem services, which can diminish the health benefits for future generations. So using up the capital beyond the natural limits of recovery. So one of the most important ecosystem services is water supply and water purification, to provide drinking water and recreational water that's safe for the human population and enhances health. And this represents one of the particular challenges for New Zealand. We have one of the highest rates of waterborne protozoan infections, so these are things like Cryptosporidium and Giardia, in the world, along with a number of other bacterial diseases which are also transmitted via water. On the left there is a plot of the number of cases of cryptosporidiosis across New Zealand against a background of river flow levels in the catchment areas provided water treatment plants. We have around about 1,800 cases per year, which for a population of 4 million is extremely high. Now, these are sporadic cases, and we also have a number of outbreaks. This is just one example of an outbreak involving just 9 cases, but this may well just be the tip of the iceberg. A peak in river flow associated with a rainfall event, resulting in a cluster of cases, in this case of campylobacteriosis, a bacterial infection, 1 incubation period later, associated with a ruminant strain. So this is most likely surface water runoff from dairy farming or from sheep farming in the catchment, resulting in an outbreak. And those pathogens that I mentioned there, cryptosporidiosis, Giardia and Campylobacter, are all examples of what we call zoonotic pathogens. So zoonotic pathogens being ones transmissible from animals to man. And this raises another important impact of ecosystem health, and that's the emergence of new infectious diseases and the resurgence of existing pathogens. And these are particularly the zoonotic pathogens. So there are around about 1,500 agents of human infectious disease, and 2/3 of those come from animals. And they're not just minor ones, these are major ones: bird flu, swine flu, SARS, dengue, all those sorts of things all come from animals. But more importantly, 3/4 of the emerging pathogens, and there's been about 80 or so over the last few decades, are also come from animals as well. And wildlife are an important source of many of those. And SARS, dengue, Nipah, and HIV virus are all examples of pathogens that have come from animals. And obviously, human movement, animal movement around the world played an important part in the emergence and resurgence of these pathogens. But also wildlife, again, is very important. So things like habitat degradation is extremely important. So when we look at New Zealand's notifiable disease register, we can see how important zoonotic pathogens are. The ones with the red stars, so most of the pathogens in the top list there, of the most common ones, come from animals. So I mentioned wildlife is an important issue. And there are some very notable ones. So human encroachment into wildlife habitats, urbanization, habitat destruction. There's some very good examples of emerging pathogens. The Nipah virus is one, thankfully, we don't have in New Zealand, but was a very good example where the burning of the rainforests in Borneo resulted in displacement of the flying foxes, which then moved into the mango orchards where pigs foraged. Pigs started to get sick, and the orchardists themselves, with a 40% mortality rate due to meningitis associated with this particular emerging pathogen. Now, we might think we're safe in New Zealand as well, but also it's worth noting that diseases like, there was a strain of salmonella that first resulted in a big die-off of sparrows and silver eyes in Christchurch. If you look at the green dots on this map here, spreading out from Christchurch to cover the whole of North and South Island over a 2-year period, resulting in 3,000 cases. It was the most common salmonella strain over that time period, and it's the second most common now. So it's a major epidemic that originated in wildlife, which has spread throughout New Zealand, of a new and emerging pathogen. So not only are wildlife sources of infection also important for human health, but also they have a role in wildlife health as well. And ecosystem health has a major impact on wildlife conservation. And so one particular area is the use of translocation as a conservation tool, which is used widely. I think there's around about 30 or so translocations a year. So these are complex networks of movements of animals to establish new populations or augment existing populations on offshore islands or mainland refuges, and that's been discussed quite a bit. But these translocations can cause problems in themselves. So often you're translocating not just the host, you're translating the pathogens as well. And these are the populations which have diminished immune repertoires, and introduced pathogens can cause all sorts of problems with those. And diseases such as avian malaria, salmonella, and beak and feather disease are all examples of these. So just to finish with, so One Health, we are seeing an interdisciplinary cross-sectoral approaches combined with new tools to provide better ways of tackling issues related to population health. And this is humans, domestic animals and wildlife alike. Molecular tools, modelling tools have led to a better understanding of how pathogens are transmitted and cycle, And techniques for things like evolutionary modelling, transmission modelling, and modelling amongst networks have improved our understandings of how pathogens have cycled. And a good example of how this has been used to a great effect was for the control of campylobacteriosis, which is a foodborne disease. In 2007, the foodborne disease was halved as a result of these modelling approaches, and that's an estimated saving of about $40 million to the New Zealand economy. And we're using similar techniques to understand how pathogens cycle within the environment, and this is helping us to understand and mitigate those sorts of issues. So this approach requires a One Health framework that recognises the interrelationships between human, animal and ecosystem health.
And last but certainly not least, earlier Don had talked about the fenced refuges as, or sanctuaries as a way to build islands of original wildlife. The vision, of course, is the whole country. Slightly larger task. Just to tell us how to do that. Is that right, Nicola? Nicola Toki, Conservation Advocate, Forest and Bird.
G'day. I'd like to thank my esteemed gentlemen colleagues for going for the age before beauty approach to speaking today. And nice to have a girl up here this afternoon, eh? Yeah. So, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Florence Hill te maunga, ko Waikawa te awa, ko Scottish te iwi, ko Valence te hapu. He kaitea ki ngāhiri me ngā manu tōku umanga, ko Nicola Toki, tōku ingoa, kia ora. So good morning everyone, I'm Nicola Toki, formerly known to some of you as Nicola Valence, but I was so inspired by Sir Paul's vision of this Transit of Venus week, you know, this idea of our dual nation and our citizenship, that in the sharing of the science and the knowledge and the innovation between our two cultures, that I married a lovely Maori fella in December. There was probably another reason I married him. It is a real honour and a privilege to be here today. I met Sir Paul at speaking at a conference in Rotorua, the pair of us were, last year, and I wangled my way onto his table at dinner, I think much to the annoyance of the organisers. He started pinching some of my presentations for his, and we became friends. And I didn't know Paul for very long, but his drive for excellence must have been wearing off on me, because last night, if you went along to last night's panel discussion, I'd mysteriously gained a doctorate. So, yeah. Regretfully, I must inform you that I am not, in fact, Dr. Toki yet. It's also a privilege to be here in such auspicious company, and it's also a little overwhelming to be here in such auspicious company, which includes some of my old colleagues, some old friends, my old university supervisor from Otago, who was horrified to see that I was still writing my speech at afternoon tea and said I hadn't changed at all, and my old boss, Al, from the Department of Conversation. Just as a brief sort of an introduction, I started out as a scientist and I became a public servant, or a shiny trousers, as some of my ranger colleagues called me. And now I'm an activist, apparently. And Gareth might say that I'm a green neck, but we'll have that discussion later. But actually, I'm not, you know, when people say an activist, Nicole Toki from Forest and Bird, it kind of freaks me out, because I'm a real goody two-shoes. And I guess while I kind of am and I'm not, my first sort of 2 weeks into my job at Forest and Bird, after 7 years as a very mostly well-behaved public servant, I was at the front of that mining march up Queen Street with 50,000 other people thinking, am I allowed? But more than anything, I believe that rather than a tree hugger or, you know, a greenie or any of the other of those sort of quite unuseful labels that people put on people like me, I'm a concerned New Zealander. I'm very proud of my heritage, and my heritage is my natural heritage, and as such I'm concerned, and I also like to make a racket, and I fiercely believe, like, you know, many of you, in standing up for it. So my talk is one of hope and of national pride, not of doom and gloom, because often with environmental issues, particularly in New Zealand, it can all feel a bit hard, and we walk that fine line between letting people know what's at stake and totally depressing everyone so that, you know, they might slash their wrists, as Gareth alluded to earlier. So I hope that we won't do that. So we're facing a world biodiversity crisis. Our biodiversity crisis is at such a level now, and the great thing about you people in the room is I don't actually have to spell this out very long. We have extinction rates now that are 100 to 1,000 times faster than anywhere else, any other time, and that's been driven by us. And it's also costing us. So for the economists in the room, at last count from one of the last international reports that came out, it's costing currently $740 billion a year to try and keep up with our conservation commitments, US dollars, $740 billion US dollars, and that's predicted to escalate to $20 trillion US dollars by 2050. So there's actually some sense, as in CENTS, involved in trying to make sure that we get this right. Now, New Zealand's situation, luckily everybody else has basically given my speech, so I guess I could just go. But we are in trouble. You know, we have lost already 42% of our birds, you know, 3 species of lizards, 3 frogs, a bat, and countless invertebrates. And we have currently nearly 4,000 threatened species, and we only look after a handful of those. You know, and I guess the obvious one that I use all the time, because it's our national bird, is that when you tell people that where we don't do pest control, we lose 95% of kiwi chicks, nobody believes me, but it's true. And that's our national bird. That's the thing that we go out and we stick on our backpacks and we put our logos all over and we sell to the world. And yet we're not doing a very good job in looking after it, because the other part of that statistic is we only do sustained pest control on 12% of our public conservation land. So what that means in very simple terms is most of the time out there, on most of the places, we're losing the battle. And the major driver, obviously, for all of that is predators. David Bellamy famously once said that New Zealand was the land without teeth, and I think that very aptly sums up the kind of native wildlife. Oh my goodness. So my idea is to bite the bullet and make New Zealand predator-free. It's not my idea, and it's in fact it's an idea, as Gareth has reminded us, that has been around for a very long time. So why has there been so much inertia? Well, we get told it's too hard, right? It's crazy. What a ridiculous idea. We never pull that off. But that's rubbish, because in the 1970s, nobody believed we could get rats off 16 hectares. And in 2005, we got them off 11,300 hectares of Campbell Island. Stewart Island is next on the list, and that seems to be rather achievable. And earlier this year, I hosted a group of 19 of New Zealand's best predator control scientists and experts, and I threw them in a room and locked them in for a couple of days and basically said, could we do it? Funding notwithstanding, social issues notwithstanding, from a Boven point of view, could we do it? And species by species, stoats, weasels, ferrets, rats, mice, possums, they said yes. So that, to me, is our go point. We don't need to discuss whether or not we do this anymore. We just say that we want it and we will start. The other thing that creates inertia is cost. And, you know, we get told that we can't afford it, that we've got all these other things that we want to do. But in New Zealand, we're very, very naughty about how we measure things. We say that dairying will bring in X billion dollars to the economy, but we don't count how much it costs in terms of the clean-up of our waterways. And I think we're starting to get there, and we're starting to get better at that, but we need to do more of it. We may think that we can't afford to, but actually we can't afford not to, because brand New Zealand is all we have, and I think we've talked enough about that today to know that that is true. We also have the need not to rip off our grandkids, because A, we signed up to it, we promised that we wouldn't rip off the next generation, and we've heard from some of our younger people here today, but also it's because it's part of our national identity. It's who we are in New Zealand, it's how we describe ourselves to the world. And because New Zealand is the closest you can get to studying life on another planet, we actually have an international kind of drive to achieve that, a responsibility as an international citizen. At dinner the other night, on the first night that we arrived, we talked about what we were good at. We asked, actually, Kate, we were asking Kate what we're really good at in New Zealand, and she said we're really good at superconductors, and we're really good at growing, we've got a growing industry in photovoltaics, and then we'll run on two other things. But the other thing that we're really good at that we hardly ever show off about is pest control. New Zealanders predator control experts are sent all around the world, to the Galapagos, to the subantarctics, to the Pacific, to teach other people how to do what we've done on our offshore islands here. It's basically, you know, it's our Nokia, if you like. So I think that that we should take these skills. We have the technology, we have the science, we certainly have the urgency, and the world is watching. So I think we should make predator-free New Zealand our outrageous goal. And I'd like to finish with the quote that Sir Paul pinched from me, which is okay because I pinched it from one of our other great conservationists, Don Merton. He said, "They are our national monuments. They are our Tower of London, our Arc de Triomphe, our pyramids. We don't have this ancient architecture that we can swoon over and wonder. But what we do have is something that is far, far older than that. No one else has kiwi. No one else has kakapo. They have been around for thousands of years, if not for millions of years, if not thousands of millions of years. And once they are gone forever. And it's up to us to make sure they never die out." And I'd like to finish with a quote from Sir Paul, who led me here today. Regarding the concept of a predator-free New Zealand, he said, "It's crazy and ambitious, but I think it might be worth a shot." Kia ora.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Nicola. Okay, well, we've essentially covered two topics here, actually. The topic of the session is not predator-free or pest-free New Zealand. The topic of the session is restoring and enhancing our environment. A predator-free New Zealand is an element, perhaps, of that. It refers, of course, to fauna. It's just as important, I would have thought, to deal with native flora as well. So it's a far wider topic than pest-free sanctuaries and so on. What I think Rick and I were both talking about was how do you internalise the costs of damaging the environment to the day-to-day decisions that we make without shooting both your feet off in terms of your economic opportunities. So there's got to be opportunities and threats in that process. But the consequences of not doing that and leaving it for the local authorities essentially to come along behind and clean up is that we are likely to end up with a economic base that is not actually sustainable and then have a major shift down the track to try and pull it back. So anyway, those are just some thoughts on the range of things that have been covered here. Feel free to, there's a microphone there now and over there, to pick up on any of that. William.
My name's William Ralston. I'm the National Vice President of Federated Farmers. And I just want to make a couple of comments. The first one is a general comment about relating to the whole day. And it boils down to the and/or argument, a discussion that I had with Sir Paul over the last probably 12 months. And I'd like to think I changed his rhetoric slightly in that. And that is, it's not an argument about instead of, high tech instead of agriculture. It's about building high tech on the top of our strengths in agriculture and our strengths in biology. And I think Sir Peter certainly made that point earlier on today. But look, what I wanted to tell you about is that about this time last year, Federated Farmers voted in a new board, and quite a different board. And they certainly wanted to see and set farmers on a journey into the future. And that was about accepting that farming does have an impact on the environment, that we do have to work within environmental constraints. And there is a balance, as Gareth just mentioned, between risk and opportunity. Our economic opportunity, our environmental risk. But those of you who saw the Dominion Post yesterday will have seen the great headline about dirty dairying and highlighting that over the last 4 years there are 150 prosecutions. What the Dominion didn't mention was the 10,500 minus 150 farmers who actually weren't prosecuted, the farmers that were actually doing a good job. And I think there needs to be a recognition of the huge amount of work that farming and farmers do around pest control and the sort of things like locking land up in QE2 trusts. Now, the Land and Water Forum, I think, has been a really good example of how we can move forward. But that Land and Water Forum was actually informed by the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, and that Canterbury Water Management Strategy was informed by the Opua Dam, which was farmers getting together, building a dam, having a positive effect on the economy and the environment. They just got on and did it. So I think it's important to recognise those. I mean, we need to talk about the dialogue and the conversation that we're having. So I have two pleas. The first plea is to the public, and that is to work with farmers, not against farmers, to solve some of these problems. And the second plea is to the science community, and that is to help us on the journey to increase productivity within our environmental constraints, and also to be able to tell us what we can do and stop telling us what we can't do. Thank you.
I think this issue of trade-offs that actually Sir Peter brought up a bit earlier, I think we need to just keep coming back to this, because we have to, make decisions on cost and benefit all the way along. I mean, just give you a couple of examples. Nicola's a real fan, so am I actually, have to admit, of 1080 in terms of the program she's talking about. Now, you know what 1080 does as soon as you mention that to people. And it sort of reminds me very much from some of the projects I've been involved in. You get these entrenched, uninformed views. Like we had that basically with the deniers when I did the climate change book. And it didn't matter what evidence you showed, there was just no way. It was sort of religious. We had it when I did the fishing book. We did a fishing book last year, and one of the conclusions on that was that the QMS system should be extended to recreational fishing because it was going off half-cock. The commercials are doing it. But at the boundary where you have recreational and commercials, the commercials have no incentive whatever to leave fish in the ocean because they know the recreationals are going to take it because they're not subject to the same. Doesn't matter how you present that case. There's a certain lobby within the recreational fishing, the Shooting Hootin' Brigade, who just will not listen to that. And I think we've got it in a number of areas. I know that William's pretty hot on GM, but really the point is we've got to have these discussions. It's that point. Last 5 years, let's talk about carbon emissions. Last 5 years, the US actually is the country. Can you believe this? The US is the country that has had the greatest reduction in emissions. 450 million tonnes. And that's because they've switched to gas to a large degree that burns half as much carbon when you use it. Europe, by contrast, emissions have gone through the roof because they've switched to coal because of the high price of gas in Europe. How have the US done it? Fracking. So they obviously have made a decision, whether it's explicit or implicit, I have no idea, that the downside to fracking does not outweigh the upside. We just say, it's a shock horror movie, go away, we don't want to actually think about it. Don't force us to do the analysis. It's the last thing we want to do. We need to grow up on this stuff. Because there are decisions, and if you start internally pricing the things, which is what Rick and I are talking about, Those decisions will have to be made every day at a micro level by people making business and household decisions.
Natalie Plank from the McDiarmid Institute. So I'm bringing forward more of our online discussion from the game Punamu. So there are two strands in the online conversation about this. One is considering how a deeper understanding of the natural environment can help us restore and work with it. But the other is putting science and the environment in antithesis. How do we move the national conversation beyond this dichotomy?
Can I make a suggestion here? My understanding is we train scientists to do the science to define the problem and to do the research to answer the problem, and then we train them to do the statistical analysis to detect whether or not there's an effect there or there's a relationship there, and at that point usually it stops, and yet at that point the debate starts to take place, often without incorporating the values and all the various aspects that we might think about in a more rigorous way in terms of how you make that decision. And I wonder if there's a gap in the training of scientists where they could actually take the analysis one step further in order to frame up the decision problem, making it explicit where the values and criteria and so on need to be put into that decision problem, so that we can actually start to build a bridge between what the raw science does and what the decision makers do.
I'm probably going to lose my train of thought in this, but I'll try not to. The first thing is just an earlier point that was made, and I've heard it a couple of times. In fact, I've heard it many, many times over the course of my career. Is just to get it out there. We don't lock up land for conservation. We invest it. We don't. It's something that we look after for our future generations. It's not locked up where nobody ever goes, and that's the end of it. But with regard to how we kind of move forward from here, because I actually think we need to get beyond the conversation about trade-offs and beyond the conversation about balance. I think we need to sort of start again and say, all right, so we all know that New Zealand has this incredible natural heritage, and we all as a country collectively think that that's quite important, and therefore we're going to use that as the sort of foundation and basis. We do it anyway. Everything we export is branded in pretty general terms based on our clean green, and we're already starting to get in trouble for not living up to that. And that's why 75% of tourists come here. So we have a reputation to uphold for purely financial reasons. And so maybe rather than a trade-off, which in the end really becomes a whittling down, because every time you trade off, you whittle away a little bit more and a little bit more, and 10, 20, 30 years down the track, you're left with very little. Maybe actually what we do is make our heritage the cornerstone of our economy, and then use it to leverage much better agricultural returns, for example, and much better innovation. That maybe is the discussion that we need to have, and that's about values. At the moment, we are progressing towards economic growth, which is based on trading off values. But maybe we need to actually dial it back a bit and start again. I have no idea if that was related or not, but hopefully it was.
Hi there, my name is Jez Weston from the Royal Society, and I would like to present a comment and make a suggestion. And by nature, I'm an engineer, but I'm going to try and talk about metaphors now, so wish me luck. What we've been talking about today, we're talking about some deep thinking, and changes of deep thinking require changes of metaphors. And Sir Peter Gluckman this morning started off by talking about post-normal science, about how science is changing. But it goes beyond that to post-normal economics, post-normal society, post-normal innovation. And we have traditionally thought of science in a very linear way. We have a bunch of researchers in a room somewhere. They come up with an idea. We take it through a very rigid development pipeline. We add capital in fixed stages. Goal is profitable growth. It's a very finite system, very clear boundaries. It's very normal. And this is the 21st century, and we've got to get beyond that. And similarly, we've talked about farming. We've talked about farming as factories for commodities. You control all the inputs, you optimize for one benefit, generally production, you intensify, you've got a short time scale. From a GDP point of view, looks absolutely great. But this is the 21st century, and we need to do better than that, and we need new metaphors and new paradigms. And I've been really struck by the way that everybody here today has always been talking about ecosystems. Because when we talk about ecosystems, then we implicitly recognize the complexity of those systems. We recognize that we have to work with a range of outside forces, whether that's weather or pests, whether that's overseas markets, or the whims of overseas investors. It's very hard to draw sharp boundaries around ecosystems. We have to not optimize for one thing, but try and satisfy a range of co-benefits. We have to think short-term and long-term and think about what we're leaving for the next generations. So whether we are innovative farmers and land managers, caring for biodiversity and getting a premium for doing that, or whether we are innovators in high-tech manufacturing, partnering with researchers and customers across the globe, across communities, across cultures, then we're trying to work with ecosystems, and it's all very post-normal. So what metaphors do we have for working with ecosystems? Well, the best metaphor I can think of is to stop thinking about factories and start thinking about gardens and start thinking about ourselves as gardeners, because we all understand what that role entails. We all understand what a garden is. We'd like to grow our fruit and veg. We'd like to hear the tui and the kaka flying overhead. We want a safe space for our kids to go up and to run around and to fall over and skin their knees and get up again. And at the end of the day, we'd like to sit down with a glass of wine and be proud of what we've created. So I just suggest that I think it would be a wonderful thing for the innovators and the science system managers that are here today to sit down with the people on this panel and the other ecosystem thinkers around and about, maybe over a glass of wine, and to think deeply about what an ecosystem model means for innovation and what an ecosystem model means for all of the rest of us. Thank you.
In the economics jargon, we don't use the word ecosystem. We talk about trade-offs, and I think it's the same thing, isn't it? I mean, if you have an ecosystem and you take a species out, you have consequences. It's not that difficult a concept. Economics is the same. What concerns me is that we're not pricing, and that's what concerns, I think, Rick and the rest of the panel probably, is we're not pricing anything but short-term environmental degradation into economic decisions. And there'll be a consequence of that, and the consequence is building around us.
Hi, I'm Oscar Rago from Wellington High School, and first I'd like to agree with Nicola on the overwhelming auspicious company. It's kind of building on the ecosystem thing, and firstly, I think it's been used a lot because it's a good metaphor for anything, well, pretty much everything that involves balance. And so I'd like to talk to Don about Zealandia, because we know the importance of these conservation areas and we know how valuable Zealandia is. And so I was wondering how you mentioned that the floor, if you want, is the self-sustainability, and that's about balancing the conservation you're doing with the economy of it. So I'd like to know sort of how you're going to look to make it a self-sustainable thing, and maybe also direct it towards Gareth, who's also involved in making something really valuable to the community self-sustainable. Thank you.
Well, certainly to be self-sustainable financially was one of our founding ambitions. And in fact, it was even bigger than that. It was about yielding surplus cash flows which we could redirect to other conservation projects. So it was actually very aspirational. In one sense, we have succeeded till now, because we've been going for 15 to 17 years. Cash has always been in short supply, but we've found parties that have come in to help us and bridge the gap. Some of those parties have been municipalities, local government, regional government, and in a sense they've been, I believe, interpreting the will of the people, if you like, to support us. At the moment we are before the Wellington Council with a request for additional funding over the next 3 years. The council has gone into a consultation process, as they're obliged to do under the applicable legislation. And I think the council has been quite profoundly informed by the community stepping up and saying, this is important, we actually endorse your ongoing funding of this organisation in such a way that doesn't diminish us, that doesn't dilute what we're trying to do. So yes, we still have the aspiration to be self-sustaining, where we're not looking for some financial crutch from, if you like, government, but it is going to take, I think, somewhat more time than we anticipated. But we do believe it's achievable over time.
From the economist's point of view?
Well, you've got to live within your budget. That's what the economist's perspective on it is. And I think the whole concept of Zealandia is absolutely fantastic, right, in terms of what it is, where it's situated actually, because it's right in the heart of a major population centre, so it has a big halo effect on education, not just birds outside the wire. But I think what happened at Zealandia, and Don sits there to correct me, is that they veered away from their core and they built a $17 million project and buggered it up in terms of the revenue. And so now they've had to go back with their handout for a handout to keep the thing together. That should not distract from the value of the sanctuary. And I think that's the problem. We have to separate the two things. I'm involved with a far bigger project, or have been. Same sort of thing, but instead of 8.6 kilometres of fence, we've got 44 up at Mangatautri. And it's a phenomenal project, same sort of thing. But God, the cost of that thing's amazing in terms of running it. $2.5 million a year to 3, somewhere in there, with about 1.5 of that being volunteer. Notice both the projects, and he was $1 million, are incredibly dependent on the community. These are community-based projects. But in our case for Mangatautri, really to make it work without going with your hand out to ratepayers every year, who get sick of it, they get donor fatigue, it's called. We have to have a commercial model. So, you know, Jan and I were on the verge of putting $2 to $3 million in there to build a canopy walk through the thing. But as soon as that was raised, the community fell apart on, oh, we can't possibly go commercial, that's so impure. And you go, oh God, that's communities for you. You know, roll up the bloody PTA. So, you know, all I'm saying is I think the Zealandia model is probably feasible. I think Mangatautri is a bit tough unless you've got control of it, because the community is just too divisive on what it really values out of it. Don, feel free to.
Well, I think the analysis is correct. I mean, looking back, the almighty wisdom of hindsight's a wonderful thing. The people who were inspired to invest this money did their homework on it. This wonderful word paradigm's been thrown around a little bit. Pre-global financial crisis, there was a different paradigm. People were ambitious. People could shoot for the stars. People could project PAX movements, passenger movements, visitors, if you like, through the sanctuary, which have proved impossible to realise. That's the reality. Now what we've got to do is deal with that, and the council is our lender of last resort, and we're working with them. But I do think, all of that notwithstanding, Zealandia is a model that can work, and what we've seen through this latest consultation process is just an overwhelming support from a large group of people in the Wellington community saying this is a good thing, we don't want to see it diminished.
But if I can just jump in there, I kind of have a question to all of you, but particularly to my colleagues here, which so I wax poetic about this being a national identity and this is something we all love. We love our nature and blah blah blah. But obviously we don't actually love it, and not just our national identity in our hearts and minds. It's the driver of our economy, both our export through tourism and our branding internationally. So we say that we stand up and we're a wee bit smug and we say that we're this country that loves this stuff, but we believe in it, we look after it, we're really good at it. But we have a situation where Zealandia can't raise enough dosh to get across the board where, you know, Gareth's facing the same situation with Mangatatri, and that things like that have been run on volunteers. You know, Forest and Bird, for example, runs 2,000 hectares of a predator-proof project in Waitakere Ranges, if any of you are from Auckland, and it's, without the volunteers it just wouldn't happen. So my question is, why do we say that we care and we don't put our money where our mouth is?
Well, the answer to that is everything's got a price, and it's not, you know, you can't just keep paying infinitely for these things. So just because we care doesn't mean to say we don't need to take responsibility for benefit for, you know, it was, somebody spoke about it earlier, one of the economists, that's why I understand it. And it's opportunity cost. You know, those dollars that now the council has to put in to save this blim visitor centre could be used for something else that's just as legitimate in terms of its claim on resources. So I think you have to take responsibility for your actions. And that tends to be the problem with community projects, because they change. You know, the trustees change, and you've got to train a new bunch of monkeys, you know, as to what the... It's incredibly
No monkeys in our
inefficient.
sanctuary.
But that's democracy. Same man.
Speaking as a monkey, I wanted to pick up on the idea of our natural heritage as a cornerstone of the economy, but also of internalising the costs, and also something from a previous session about these new, the demands that are coming from the markets, the international, the global markets, for goods that are sustainably produced, including our primary products, including timber, including beef, including sheep, you know, the full range. And we've been talking about, and there's been this endless conversation actually about dairy cows and rivers, but we need to think in this part of the country they're not the problem actually, it's forestry. Because what you have is hundreds and thousands of hectares of forest that were planted on highly erodible soils as soil conservation forests, that in the 80s, because we flogged off everything, you know, kind of a lot of the cutting rights were sold and a lot of the land was sold, and now those forests are being harvested. And they're being harvested in such a way that there's birds' nests of slash stuck up on the hills, and when it rains, they come down the gullies, they gouge it out, that acts like a whole bunch of bulldozers, and as you saw up at Uawa, it ends up on the beaches. So my idea, the positive idea out of that, because that could be a heartbreaking kind of scenario, you could get really depressed about it, but the positive idea is that most of these forestry companies actually belong to the Forestry Stewardship Council in Bonn, and they have that registration, most of them. And in the new standards that have been set, that have been pre-agreed by the industry, they have to set aside bush buffers by all of their permanent waterways on both sides, and also supposed to set aside 10% of the plantation area in native bush, and they're supposed to actually look after that with pest and weed control. If that happened, you would get the biodiversity gains in the Tairāwhiti from heaven, and you would also look after the waterways. So why is it not happening? If you look on Google Earth, you won't see bush buffers. If you look at the clearance, the clear felling that's happening is happening right down to the waterways. And yet, our logs are being marketed as though they're sustainably produced, the ones that are going out in the trucks that everybody's talking about. So, internalise the costs, I agree with Gareth, absolutely. Cornerstone of our economy, I agree, totally. And it means that we have to be honest, actually. In our science, you know, I've been reading a lot of the research around forestry. Some of it seems to me to be purchased, to be blunt. You know, our science has got to be honest, and our environmental monitoring systems have to be honest. And at the moment, I suspect they're not very honest at all. And if they were, and this would be fantastic, because then, you know, we've got these logs, we would have bush buffers. Probably, if we were really smart, we'd grow them over time, and then we might find that matai and tōtara are worth infinitely more than Pinus radiata, you know, and we might find that we learn how to actually grow those and learn to process them ourselves on the coast, have good jobs for people instead of getting cut up with chainsaws, and, you know, have high-value jobs, high-value timber, sustainable close canopy forests, and start with the waterways, because this is my ideas. You know, as I said, I'm a monkey, you know. We've started this idea of the eco-sanctuary, great, but you're not going to save the species that way. We all know that. I reckon the waterways are fantastic because you get a corridor immediately for biodiversity, and the birds and the plants and the animals like being near the water. So that's my thought. I just wanted to throw it in there. I get almost tired of people talking about cows. Let's think about trees.
No, that's very good. Thanks very much, Daniel. But there's two things there for me coming out of that. One is the idea of integrity, which actually sheets back to the discussion this morning in terms of that interface with the Maori approach to science, and the importance of integrity. The other thing is internalising the cost, which that's a version of. One of the arguments you hear all the time from the lobby group is, well, if you do that, you'll kill us. We'll never get the thing off the ground. But there's always an opportunity. Back here comes the economist again. There's always another opportunity for where the money can invest it. There's infinite numbers of opportunities. I think in terms of the internalising, basically, you can see it as having two ways. You either clean up the mess from your forest going down the river onto the beach when you log it from all the mud, or you prevent it, which is really what you're saying. But either way, the true cost of that industry is not being reflected by the people who are, carrying it out. And I think that's the point. Don.
Gareth, I have a confession to make. I'm a director of a timber company. It was one of the Fletcher Challenge forests. It was bought by a Canadian pension plan, Ontario Teachers. So we have 365,000 Ontario teachers who, I've got to say, are a highly principled shareholder group to have. And we are committed to the FSC. It's not going to happen overnight. But the bigger thing that's taught, that I've been taught, I guess, is having been involved in a number of infrastructure businesses here in Australia, is that the community will have the last say. We have to earn their trust to have a licence to operate. And if we do step outside that, we will be found out and we will be dumped on, and properly so. So I think we're doing a lot of growing up in that respect. So the community grants us a licence in the broadest sense. The different councils, in a sense, police us, and properly so. And if we veer off the straight and narrow, we get found out and dumped on. And that's the way it should be. So certainly in my company, the company I'm a director of, we are picking up these responsibilities very seriously indeed. And I hope we can demonstrate that. Thank you.
Just really quickly, I think we're already seeing the consequences of what happens, Damien, if we don't do what we say we're doing. And I spoke, I think, a little bit last night about in 2009, Waitrose of supermarkets in the UK kicked New Zealand out in terms of our hoki and our orange roughy because we couldn't make the grade. And because we are a small country, and we've talked a lot this morning, there's been a lot of people talking about how we're crap at being a big country. We're really good at being a small country, and perhaps a small country needs to focus on quality of products and quality of reputation rather than quantity. And that, I think, would be a good foundation for that cornerstone of where we go now.
Okay, now time is up, but we have 5 people who have been very patient. So we're going to go through the 5 people just as briefly if you can, guys. Sorry, but that's time.
Okay. Thanks. I'm Jonathan Clearwater. I'm a scientist for Mighty River Power. My question's mostly been covered in some ways, but both Gareth and others have suggested that internalising these costs of water pollution, air pollution, and other things would go a long way to preserving our natural environment. And I was actually hoping for some practical steps we could take in the next few years to do a better job of internalising those costs in different areas.
Well, one way is for the recovery agent, the local council, just to charge back to whose mess it is they're cleaning up. But that's an ex post. So what you really want to do is be smarter than that and price it in before the damage is done, so that people make the right decisions. So there's various ways, and Anne's way was the same sort of thing. Just encourage the behaviour to prevent the downside.
you could take the GST and accept some complexity to get some power and differentiate it according to the cost and just internalise it with an instrument we've already got.
Corrective tax, that's called. Right.
I get a little bit tired about talking about trees. So and just referring back to yesterday's mural at Tolaga Bay, you'll notice how out of proportion the fish were compared to the trees. Kia ora everyone, my name's Samara Nicholas. I'm from an organisation called Mountains to Sea Conservation Trust. I run a program called Experiencing Marine Reserves. I'd just like to put it out there, the reason I wanted to speak was because it was mentioned about Yellowstone Park, and if anyone has ever snorkeled at Goat Island, you'll notice that marine reserve there, if you look out to Hauturu, Little Barrier Island, it was actually a 100-year lag between our marine conservation and our land conservation. And it was also mentioned that we are a world leader in marine conservation, yet our last marine reserve to be created was basically just a brand change. Tawharanui Marine Park was changed from a marine park, which was theoretically a marine reserve because there was no take, to a marine reserve last year. We are world leaders in the fact that we have the only high school in the world that we know of that has established a marine reserve. That was Kamo High School in the Whangarei Harbour. And I'd just quickly like to put out there the economic benefits for the Whangarei community, although it hasn't been substantiated in any reports, but you've probably read the economic benefits of Goat Island Marine Reserve to our economy. Whangarei Harbour Marine Reserve was a 16-year project. It's now been established for 5 years. And we're taking thousands of students out there snorkelling. The reason I want to mention it too is because the inspirational opportunity and how exciting the science is coming out of marine reserves. It's really exciting science. It's a fantastic way to engage not only our students in New Zealand in science, but also our communities, to make them feel more connected to their environment, because what other kind of, you can't go flying with the birds, but you can go swimming with the fish. And it is a fantastic way to feel completely immersed in another world and stimulate you into action. Marine reserves, they create a more resilient ecosystem, fantastic educational opportunities, economic opportunities, and what I'd like to put out there to you guys, it's very easy as well, by the way. We don't need to put a fence up. All we need to do is just leave it, and make sure everyone leaves it, and we have an amazing conservation initiative, and it is a wet library. So my question or my comment to all of you is, I'm very short, I have to tippy-toe here, why not have more wet libraries around New Zealand? Yeah, kia ora.
Okay, now let's just try and keep it to a couple of minutes each if we can. Be great. That's way over time. Thanks.
Kia ora, Jenny. I spoke earlier this morning that this time I'm speaking from my life in Wellington. I was a neighbour of where Karori Wildlife Sanctuary is and was one of the volunteers involved in establishing it. And also want to acknowledge Jim Lynch, the man who had the big idea that lots of people said couldn't happen. I used to jog and walk up the hill from Highbury to the windmill, wind turbine, before, and then when we put the fence up, I had this thought one day, we've got it wrong. We should be fencing the city in and letting everything else rebalance. And that thought kept coming back to me listening to the panel, especially we had Gareth, Rick, and then Don, all the other way around. Rick, I think, was talking to us about the key paradigm shift that I thought our speakers, particularly this morning, were also talking about, and I was feeling excited that, but to be in a forum I've been waiting for the whole of my working life, where all the different disciplines that I've been involved in were coming together with that paradigm shift. We've got to get what we call in the Western language, systems, ecosystem, ecological model to economy and to human existence in balance with our environment. And
as Rick was saying, if we don't grasp that and find a way of making that work, basically we're not going to have a soft landing. And I thought it was really interesting. I think the big risk is we put too much energy into creating little fenced eco sanctuaries, or not fenced, and not into that big picture. Both have to happen, but let's not forget what Rick said too, and I've been really interested to continue that conversation if we had another 3 days, to hear what Rick, Gareth, and and other more learned people than me about this would say about how that could work. How can we use balance instead of trade-off? Where would that take us?
Yeah, I mean, so Peter's right. It's exactly the same thing. It's just I'm using my, jargon, and someone else is using ecosystem, and you're using balance. This is actually what we talked about this earlier today, that, we're in our own blimmin' silos, defined a lot of it by jargon. And it's funny when you get the same people in the room that they're actually speaking the same language. We found that on that ship when we locked those 10 scientists in with ordinary people, that they could actually speak English. It was unbelievable, experience.
Thanks, Ian Taylor. William mentioned to me today he was up in Tolaga Bay and he had a backpack on. He took a piece of paper out of the backpack. It was the program for the Knowledge Wave Conference. Now, this week, in the last 7 days, I've been presenting at I've presented at 5 conferences. So my question really to the board is when and how do we move from hui to dewey? I'm in my 60s now, so I can't wait for a 10-year plan. So what will we have done in 10 days' time, in 10 weeks' time, in 10 months' time? I think that's really important. Just a second point very quickly. So Peter mentioned that, the community was really important. That science put the arguments together, the community made the decisions on where we go. Well, I just had a text here from my mates who said, golf at 8:40 tomorrow on Saturday morning. Now, I know for sure that when I play golf, we'll be talking about the Highlanders, that stadium. The minute I mention ecosystems or trade-offs or any of those sorts of things, I'll be playing on my own. So, how do we bring the community along? Because I can guarantee not one thing discussed here will be on One Network News tonight. Thank you.
Well, you're actually wrong. Yeah, because we're on Close-Up tonight with $1 Million Mouse, which is the project we're doing down at the Antipodes. The answer to the question, I think, Ian, is you just do stuff. And we talked about this in the radio debate we had last night with Kim, the big vision, and I was sort of poking borax at it a bit, because the same reasons you are now. And to me, it's a ground-up thing. But when you talk to the people in this room individually, you talk to Dayman, or there's so many. They're actually doing stuff, in their own communities anyway. And I think it's just a matter of just keeping that momentum. So don't get depressed because we're coming to these blimmin' talk fests and we've got jargon problems. We go back home and we talk about the hurricanes as well.
Kia ora koutou. My name's Geraldine Peters. I'm from Auckland University of Technology. I just wanted to bring in another voice, and I really wish that this person could be here to bring this voice in as well. I'm not a scientist, but my work is in cultural studies of this place, and also in documentary, and documentary as a way of storytelling, of narrative, of argument fashioning. There was someone whose work in preparation for this week, I went back to, someone who's spoken to me a great deal about many of the issues that are brought up here today, and he had something to say that I think very nicely brings together a number of the threads. I speak particularly to the threads around arts and humanities. Certainly this guy spoke to my friends who are artists and my friends who are writers. Many of you probably know him as well, Jeff Park, and he had something, I think, quite, well, of the many wonderful things he had to say. He said something, and this was in the Theatre Country book that he wrote. I don't know if it's possible to love an ecosystem, but I am confident that the rediscovery, restoration, and reconnection I sense going on at the present will be stronger in 2020 than now.
and that, more than ever before, what we call conservation might be happening less by government intervention than via simple citizenship, what Jaquetta Hawkes once described as a patient and increasingly skillful lovemaking that persuades the land to flourish. I just wanted Jeff's voice to come into the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's it. Wraps up the first day. It's a great day, I think. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panel, and see you at dinner. Cheers.
Just an executive decision, the buses will be leaving at 6:15 now, so just to give everybody a little bit more time.